My name is Michael Bussee, and I am an ex-gay leader. And I'm one of the co-founders of Exodus International, which shut down in 2012. So Gary and I were on a plane trip. We had been invited to a big conference back in Indianapolis, United Church of Christ General Annual Meeting, to give our testimonies about how we were former homosexuals. Because at the time, that denomination was debating whether or not to ordain openly gay ministers. And a group that was against that wanted us to come as proof that you could change if you wanted to. So Gary and I started talking to each other on the plane, ended up breaking down, crying, sobbing, and the stewardess goes by like, what's happening with these guys? But we decided that we couldn't do our usual speech. And we couldn't cancel because we were already on the plane. So we got there, the conference was all set up, we got up to give our testimonies, and we came out. There were people in the back of the room that were gay protesters, actually, in the back of the room. They were saying, "Love, not cure." They were holding signs. They were expecting us to give an ex-gay testimony, and instead we said, "We're gay. We can't promote this anymore. It's not true." And we said that we believe the church should unconditionally love and accept gay people in their midst. Well, the gay protesters in the back started cheering, and the people that invited us in the front row started looking at us like, "Oh my God, what are these guys saying? Get them off, get them off." But that's where we came out. We came out to each other, and we came out publicly. But then we realized, oh my God, this means we're going to have to leave the ministry. And this means we're going to have to leave our wives, and this means we're going to have to leave our children. Well, Gary had actually gotten married at 16. Not because he had to, just because he wanted to. And he had, by that time, 4 children by the time we came out. And I had the one daughter. So we knew that it meant coming out to our wives, coming out to our kids, coming out to our families, leaving the ministry, starting our lives over again as a couple. Well, I was involved with ex-gay ministry from 1974 until 1979 when we left. Exodus had started in 1976, so I was only involved with Exodus for about 3 years before Gary and I came out. My wife, Ann, I had told her that I struggled with same-sex attractions before we were married, and she also believed that if she had enough faith and if she was a good enough wife, I could overcome it. So when I came out to her, she took it as a personal failure, that there was something wrong with her, which is tragic, and that's something that these ex-gay programs don't like to talk about. And that's the collateral damage that they cause to family members who are blamed for the person being gay, or to the spouse who's encouraged to marry somebody who's gay. She felt like a failure. She felt very depressed. Plus, she had to cope with the fact that I had fallen in love with her best friend's husband, which sounds like some sort of weird soap opera, but 2 men, married men with children, their wives are best friends with each other, come out and decide to marry each other. Well, of course, when we came out, we had to leave the church. All of those Christian friends who said that they would love us no matter what, guess what? They decided there were conditions. So we lost all of our friends, all of our support. My mom said that it was worse than my dad dying of cancer, and she wanted to drive her car off a cliff. So we didn't have a very warm welcome out, and it was just the 2 of us. But in a way, I think that kind of strengthened our relationship because we had to really depend on each other. I used to be a tenor. I actually on purpose lowered my voice so that people wouldn't make fun of my voice. And so now I sing low bass in the chorale. Yeah, so it actually kind of worked in favor. I knew that I had attraction to men very early on, probably first grade. I had a crush on a boy in my first grade class named Tommy, and I just thought he was the coolest thing. Of course, I couldn't say that. I didn't have a name for it. I didn't know that that meant that I was gay. I just wasn't interested in girls, but I was really interested in him. When I realized I had those feelings, it wasn't so much that I knew that they were wrong, I just knew that nobody else ever talked about something like that. Maybe I had picked up the sort of unspoken rule that you didn't talk about that. Maybe there was something wrong about it, but I kept it quiet. It was a secret I had. In elementary school, I began to be aware of the fact that I was different and that there was something wrong with that because I started getting bullied. Kids would call me names like queer, homo. I had no idea what those words meant. I just knew that they meant that there was something really wrong with you. I would get spit on, rocks would be thrown at my head, I'd get beaten up on the playground. So that, of course, reinforced this idea there must be something really, really wrong with me that other boys didn't like. The girls didn't mind. I played jacks with them and jump rope and hopscotch, but that was not something boys were supposed to do. Well, I remember one day at recess, one of the boys called me a homo, looked right at me and called me a homo. And I thought, what in the world is a homo? So I didn't have anybody to ask. I didn't dare ask my dad or my parents. So I went to the only place that I could think of where I might get an answer, and that was the public library. And so I was curious to see if that word would be somewhere in one of the books. Back then they had card files, so I started looking through the card files, and I couldn't find the word homo, but I found 5 cards for books about homosexuality. I thought, what in the world is homosexuality? It was interesting that on each of the cards there were these red letters in the corner that said locked case, which meant you had to ask special permission to see those books. You couldn't just check them out or get them off the shelf. You had to ask this very scary-looking librarian with the gray hair and the glasses, may I please see these books? And so I wrote down the titles and the numbers, and I nervously took them over to her. I must have been like 11 or 12.
Oh, wow.
And I said, I'd like to check out these books. And she looked at me and she said, why do you want to see those books? And I said, I'm doing a report for school. And she said, well, I suppose. And she handed me the books, but then she said, as I was walking away with them, she shouted out, make sure you don't just leave those books on the table. I have to lock them up when you're done. And I thought, oh my God, this is really bad if she has to lock up these books about what I am after I'm through reading them. But I took them to the side of the library and I sat there for a couple of hours and read about what was wrong with me. Well, see, I grew up in the early 60s at a time when being homosexual was a sin and a sickness and a crime. And all 5 of the books were unanimous that homosexuality was a mental illness. In fact, the books were filed under abnormal psychology. So I was abnormal, according to these books. And I started looking for what caused it. And they all agreed that maybe you were traumatized as a kid, or you had really bad parents, or there were hormonal problems. Right next to the articles about homosexuality, there were people with facial deformities and all sorts of weird problems. And I thought, I'm a freak. I'm a psychological, biological freak. And I thought, is there a way to cure this? This is still about 11 or 12. Is there a way to cure this? Because I wanted to figure out a way to stop being bullied and to be normal. So I found one book, just one out of the 5, that said there was an off chance that you could change it. If 3 things. You were young. I was young. If you were highly motivated. I was highly motivated. And if you were bisexual. And I thought, oh God, there's something else? Bisexual? What's bisexual? So I had to look that up. And I determined real early on about that. When I left the library that day, I thought, I'm going to figure out a way to fix myself. Well, what I decided to do, because I knew I needed therapy and I couldn't talk to my parents about it, I would have to raise some money to pay for therapy. So I started collecting empty soda bottles. I think if I collected enough, I could cash them in and maybe go for a couple of sessions with a therapist. I never collected enough soda bottles to go. But all through my junior high years and my high school years, I kept reading and researching and trying to figure out a way to suppress the feelings, at least if I couldn't become straight like the other boys, at least to not have the feelings. Then in high school, the Jesus movement happened. It was sweeping, especially the West Coast. Jesus freaks were coming to the Lord in great numbers. People were leaving drug and alcohol problems, and they were getting baptized in the Pacific Ocean. And I thought, these people are crazy, because I was an atheist. I wasn't raised religious at all. I went to a Christian club on campus, and I thought, I'm going to talk these people out of it. And they talked me into it. I still wasn't really looking at the faith at that time as a way to get out of homosexuality, because I'd never been to a gay bar. I'd never met another gay person. I didn't know they existed. I thought I was the only one. But I went away to college, and in my first year at the university, I heard about a church in town in Anaheim, right across the street from Disneyland of all places, that did healings, miracle healings. And I thought, maybe if I have enough faith, maybe if I get the right kind of prayer, maybe Jesus will heal me of this. And so I got involved in the church there and started praying that God would change my orientation. It was that time that I really got focused on trying to change it through Christianity. I told one friend that I had these feelings, and he said, well, maybe you just need to date girls. And so I thought, well, who would I date? And there was a girl in choir that I really liked and admired, a very good friend, and I asked her out on a date. And it went very, very well, and I thought, maybe I'm not gay, because that was fun to go on a date. I didn't feel any sexual attraction to her. But I thought, maybe this is the beginning of the healing. Maybe Jesus is going to make me heterosexual.
Okay.
And eventually we got engaged and got married. I thought I was the only person on earth that had those feelings, except for the abnormal people that I read about in the books at the library. So I knew there must be some more abnormal people like me out there, but I had never met one. When I went to Melodyland, the church in Anaheim, I started meeting people and reading about people who were gay, and that was the first time I remember hearing the word gay. This was about 1973, and in a strange sort of way, getting involved in Christianity is what introduced me to being gay. Do you join the community? Because there were people who were starting to come out and who were proud about it. I even met some at college. Do I join up with that, or do I continue to try to overcome it? Melodyland Christian Center, which was a church I got involved with, was an old theater in the Round. And they had done Broadway plays and concerts there. They had a big sign across the street from Disneyland. They called it Melodyland. Well, when the church bought the theater, I guess they didn't have the money to change the sign, so they left the name Melodyland, which I thought was pretty strange, a church called Melodyland. Melodyland essentially was a big mega church. It sat about 2,000 people in the Round, and they packed those services. They did 2 services in the morning, 1 in the evening, and every Thursday they had a healing service, because this was a charismatic church where they believed in miracle healings and the baptism of the Holy Spirit and speaking in tongues, things like that. I thought it was kind of odd that they scheduled Jesus only on Thursday mornings to do healings. I thought, shouldn't he be able to do healings every other day? But Thursday mornings, people would come by busloads. A lot of old people with, arthritis and cancer, because they were told that if they had enough faith, they could claim their healing. There's a type of theology that I call name it and claim it. It's based on the idea that if you have enough faith, you can just announce to God that you are claiming something and it will come to pass. So if you wanted a fancy new car, you could just lay your hands on a Cadillac in the parking lot and go, Lord, I claim one for myself. If you needed a new job, you could claim that by faith. If you needed healing from cancer, you claimed that by faith. And every Thursday, people would come forward to receive healing, and they would claim their healing. And I met some people that had overcome drug abuse or other kinds of problems, and apparently some physical problems too. And I thought, well, if God can do that, surely he can remove my same-sex attractions and make me the way he intended me, which was to be heterosexual. So I started naming it and claiming it. And the idea is that you believe that it's already happened in heaven when you claim it. It's going to take a while for it to manifest itself here on earth, but it's already been done in heaven if you have enough faith. I heard about a hotline that the church had. I was studying psychology across the street at the university, and I thought, is there a way to integrate my psychological training with what's going on at Melodyland? And I found out they had this suicide prevention hotline, drug abuse hotline, and I volunteered to work there. So I went in to talk to the director, and I had to fill out this application to become a volunteer counselor on the hotline. And it had a question at the very end. It said, is there anything else in your background? For example, former drug addict, former prostitute, former homosexual, that would prevent you from being a counselor? And I thought, oh my God, there's a former homosexual? There's such a thing as a former homosexual? Oh my God. And I went to the director and I said, I left that blank because I'm a gay Christian. And he looked at me and said, no, Michael, you're not. I said, yeah, I am. He goes, no, you're not. If you're a Christian, you cannot be gay. You are not gay. You are ex-gay. Ex-gay? That was the first time I'd heard that word too. He said, from now on, I want you to name and claim that you are an ex-gay. I was never comfortable being gay and Christian. There was always this conflict. I knew that I believed in my faith, but I knew darn well that I was gay. But you're not supposed to say that word. You're supposed to say, I suffer from same-sex attractions. Because gay was accepting it. Gay was glorifying it. You know, you wouldn't say that you were a Christian murderer, would you? You know, so they equated the two things. So I just said I was struggling with same-sex attractions. And you'll hear that phrase a lot in these ex-gay programs. I'm not gay, I just struggle with same-sex attractions. I don't have any opposite-sex attractions, but I'm not gay. I noticed that the church had all these support groups that met in the evening for other kinds of issues. There were support groups for single parents. There were support groups for people that had lost a loved one. Support groups for people struggling with drug or alcohol abuse. And I looked in the church, announced a bulletin, and I thought, how come there's no support group for people who suffer from same-sex attractions? You'd think they'd have that. So I made an appointment with the pastor at Melodyland, and I said, I noticed you don't have a support group for people with same-sex attractions. And he said, maybe God's calling you to do that. I thought, what? God's calling me to start a group? So he said, we'll give you a room. We'll give you a room right off the sanctuary here. You can use it for Bible study. You can start your own support group for former homosexuals. And because the pastor said it, I thought, well, maybe I am being called to do this. So we started meeting every Tuesday night. So the pastor looked at me and said, well, why don't you start a group, support group for people with same-sex attractions? And I didn't feel qualified at all. I didn't know how to help people become ex-gay, but taking it on faith again, we started meeting every Tuesday night. We had about 12, 15 guys that would come. Very similar to an AA meeting. We would go around this circle, introduce yourself, talk about your experience with same-sex attraction, talk about your faith. And actually it was a pretty wonderful experience because I was finally meeting people like me who understood the struggle. And initially the focus really wasn't on changing your orientation or becoming straight. It was becoming a more centered Christian, because the idea was that the more you read the Bible, the more you prayed, the more you fellowshipped with other Christians, hung out with other Christians, God would reward that faithfulness, and eventually the same-sex attractions would sort of melt away and your inherent heterosexuality would emerge. Because after all, God created you heterosexual. What I did notice over time is it became kind of a Tuesday night confessional. We'd go around the circle and people would tell the stories about how they fell the week before. Oh, I fell and I engaged in masturbation while looking at porn, and everybody would go, oh, well, let's pray for brother so-and-so, and we'd lay hands on him and pray that he wouldn't masturbate the coming week. Or somebody would say, I went to a bookstore and had an encounter with somebody, and you'd pray for them. After a while, it became more about these lurid stories of falling than it did about victory. And I thought, something's wrong here. Nobody's changing. But I couldn't say that out loud because I was the leader and I was supposed to be encouraging them to stay faithful. But I started having these cracks in my belief that I could change it. By that time I was married, my wife was expecting, and that was very difficult because I just could not feel sexual attraction to her. My daughter was conceived thinking about another guy, which made me feel terrible because I felt like I was cheating on her even though I was being technically faithful to her. To function, I had to fantasize about men. One Tuesday, a new guy came into group, and his name was Gary. And he was attending the theology school there at church, and I just fell. He was gorgeous. Looked like a blonde surfer boy with blue eyes, and in his early 20s. I was in my early 20s. I couldn't take my eyes off of him. Plus he was married and he had kids, so I could relate to his story. So he and I became very, very good friends. And together we started doing some of the workshops because other churches would come to us and ask, could you come to our church and share your testimony of your healing? And I thought, oh God, I've got to share the testimony of my healing. But we started going out and doing these speaking engagements, and Gary and I would do them together. Churches heard about our ministry and they would ask, can you come and share your testimony about how God delivered you from homosexuality? And I thought, oh God, I've got to talk about how I was delivered. I'm still struggling with this. But again, you're told to proclaim it, preach it, name it and claim it, and it'll happen. So we took it as an act of faithfulness to go out and announce. All the time, I realized I was falling in love with Gary. I was falling in love for the very first time in my life, since first grade, when I fell in love with Tommy. But I was really falling in love with somebody. I loved my wife, I cared about her, but to fall in love with somebody, body, soul, and spirit, and to feel that kind of feeling I had never had before, that felt whole, like real love, I didn't know what to do with it. So I hid it. And found out later Gary was feeling exactly the same thing. In about 1974, we started getting a lot of inquiries, first from churches in our own area, and then, I don't know how they found out about us, but churches in other places in Southern California, and then even out of state, and then all across the country, started writing to us, asking for tapes of our testimony, asking for literature, booklets. We didn't have any literature or booklets. But we started getting all these requests, and Gary ended up coming up on staff of the program to handle all these media requests and to do all this mailing. And we made up our own little brochures and our own little handouts on how to help somebody who's gay, and sending a tremendous volume of these. It was about that time that we heard about another ministry. We thought we were the only one. We heard about a ministry up in Northern California called Love in Action that was started by Frank Worthen. And apparently he was doing street preaching up there, handing out his testimony at gay bars. And he had some cassette tapes. And I thought, we got to meet this guy. You know, we're not the only one. He's got a little ministry up in Northern California. And so we met Frank through correspondence that way. And I got this idea because he knew about a few other small little ministries that were starting in different parts of the country. I thought, why don't we get all these little ministries together and hold a conference? So in September of 1976, a group of 66 delegates came to Melodyland, and we had a 3-day conference. And at the end of that conference, we decided to form an organization, and we called the organization Exodus, because we thought, like the Old Testament story of Exodus, that we were going to bring whole throngs of people out of the wilderness of homosexuality into the promised land of God's straightness. I mean, kind of grandiose, huh? But we thought that God was calling up this ministry. The proof of it is there were these other programs too. So that's when Exodus was formed. It was in September of 1976. So we actually met Joseph Nicolosi. I thought he was a nut. I thought this man was totally crazy because I knew enough about psychology at that time to know that his research methods were really bad and that his assumptions were really bad. This wasn't science. This was pseudoscience wrapped up in religion and marketed. We tried to apply some of that disease model to what we were doing. And a lot of the guys that came to our program kind of fit that stereotype, that they had difficult relationships with their fathers or overprotective relationships with their mothers. Of course, a lot of straight people have that dynamic too. And a lot of people in our group didn't have that dynamic. I had a good relationship with my dad. My mom wasn't, I mean, she was a mom, but my parents weren't dysfunctional parents. I think it would have worried my dad and my mom to know that I had these feelings, so I hid them. But Narth believed at that time that if you were gay or lesbian, you definitely were abused, probably sexually. And if you didn't remember it, you had repressed it. How convenient. And even if you hadn't been, you were taught to believe that you had been. Then there was this pop psychology that started coming out about healing of memories, that through guided imagery, you could recall suppressed memories of painful events from your childhood, and they would take you back to those moments, and maybe your dad scolded you a little harshly, and they'd go, see, there you go. That's that dysfunctional relationship with your father. And you think, well, maybe it's true. So yeah, there was some of that. And then they'd ask you to visualize Jesus in that same situation, like when your dad was scolding you, they would have you visualize that Jesus was there hugging you and saying, no, you're not a bad boy, and that was supposed to heal it, which I thought was the corniest could be. They were starting to preach this idea that if you could form a very close bond, non-sexual bond, with another male, that could be healing.
What do you think it actually does?
I'm going to hug you and touch you until you don't like it anymore and become straight. It's nonsense, that whole idea. We never got involved in that because I kind of realized that was also kind of dangerous. Get into some hug therapy, and then where does that lead?
Right.
And I knew enough about counseling ethics that I thought, no, we're not going to get involved in that stuff. Over time, what I started noticing was happening at the group was that not only were the same-sex attractions getting stronger, but so was the guilt, so was the depression, so was the self-destructive behavior. We had guys that got so depressed that they were really abusing a lot of drug and alcohol because they felt guilty that they couldn't change. We had people coming to group saying that they contemplated suicide, or they may even have had a suicide attempt or an urge to drive their car into a tree. A couple of things turned it around for me. One was this realization that nobody was changing and they were actually getting worse. Probably the straw that broke the camel's back there is I had one young man that came to talk to me one day, private session, and he said, I hurt myself last night. And I said, what do you mean you hurt yourself? And he said, I cut myself. I said, what do you mean you cut yourself? And he said, down there. I said, what happened? And he said he had gone home after a fall and repeatedly cut his genitals with a razor and then poured Drano on the wounds. And I thought, this has gotten very, very sick. Not only are we not helping people, we're really, if we're driving people to this kind of behavior, I need to stop doing this. This must have been about 1978, after Exodus had started. About the same time that I noticed guys becoming self-destructive and not changing, there was something else I noticed, and that's that the love that I felt for Gary had gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And I couldn't deny that anymore. And those two things, seeing the destructiveness of what we were doing and feeling the love for him, just started tearing me apart inside, to the point I just couldn't do it anymore. Gary and I had been invited to speak to a conference back in Indianapolis. I think it was for the United Church of Christ, if I remember correctly, to share our testimonies. And on the plane trip there, we started talking really honestly with each other for the first time. And we broke down, both of us started crying, and we admitted that we were in love with each other and that we weren't ex-gay. And we decided how we couldn't go to Indianapolis and say that we were former homosexuals when we weren't. When Gary and I left in 1979, we sort of assumed that Exodus would die after that. And so we didn't pay any attention to what was happening. This was before the internet, we wanted it to go away anyway. But then we started hearing that it hadn't died and that it was actually growing. And there were ministries in Europe and there were ministries in Asia, and it was becoming this huge thing after we left. And it was getting involved in right-wing politics. Exodus had always prided itself on being non-political. Like Alcoholics Anonymous, you don't take any certain political stance. We were always politically neutral. If we were asked to speak against gays or in support of anti-gay legislation, we always said no. In fact, we were invited by Anita Bryant, of all people, by her husband and by Anita Bryant, to share our testimonies and go on the road with her, and we told her no, which upset her husband, who was trying to arrange all that. When I found out that Exodus had gone political, that really bothered both me and Gary. When we found out that they had turned it into a money-making enterprise, that really bothered us too, because Exodus had always been strictly free, and nobody was paid staff. The counselors and group leaders were all volunteers. And I thought it should remain that way, but when money and politics get involved in something, it gets even worse. I do think there's definitely a profit incentive for a lot of the ministries that keep going. Some of the ministries are still very small and still maybe funded only by their local church, so they don't have the backing of a lot of influential donors. What really troubled me is when Exodus got involved with Focus on the Family, and money started pouring in, and they could put together these huge conferences with the big screens and the video and I was appalled, actually. There's kind of a heady sort of pride that comes up, and you think, God must be raising us up because look at the money that's coming in, and look at these influential groups that want us to come speak. You're like, star, I was glad we got out before then, but I do think there's that appeal. Yeah. And I think as long as homophobia exists, these ministries will resurface in some form or another. Maybe not as big, maybe not as organized as Exodus, but who knows? I mean, with today's current political climate, it troubles me a lot to see some of these ministries trying to reform, regroup. One of the things that prompted Gary and I to come out was that late in the 1980s, people around us started coming down with this gay disease that didn't have a name yet. And then it had a name. And then we heard of people that we knew getting sick and dying. And then Gary was diagnosed with HIV in the late 1980s. He tested positive, I tested negative. And at that time, there wasn't any real medical help, so we knew his time was limited. It was really Gary who encouraged me to get more public. He said, Mike, we have limited time. I have limited time. We need to share our stories. We need to come out more strongly against these programs. I mean, it's fine that we've put our lives back together, but these organizations still exist out there. We need to speak out. So we decided to become much more public about it. We were interviewed for a documentary film called One Nation Under God that was the first kind of expose of the ex-gay movement. And Gary passed away before the film could be shown, before it was completed. And the filmmaker dedicated it to Gary's memory. Of course, the ex-gay ministries took advantage of that to say, see, it's God's judgment. When Gary and I left in 1979, I sort of thought that the other leaders of ex-gay programs would reach out to us in love and plead with us to come back and pray for that our minds would be cleared. Instead, I got hate mail saying that on the final day, Gary and I were going to be pushed into the fiery pit of hell. And I thought, this is the unconditional love that you guys have been preaching? I was kind of amazed at how deep the fundamentalist theology and the turn and burn stuff really was, because we didn't focus on that. But for some of these ministries, that's absolutely what fuels this. It's that condemnation, God's judgment. And they took advantage of the AIDS epidemic, which really angered me, because here was Gary dying of AIDS, and I was taking care of him. And they were preaching at Exodus that this was God's judgment. See, Romans says that they received in their own bodies the due penalty of their error, and here it is happening. And Exodus actually grew during that time. And on the backs of people that were suffering and dying of AIDS. It was appalling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Knowing what I know now, I would have not gotten involved in Melodyland, and I would have paid closer attention to the out front, loud and proud gays that were attending Cal State Fullerton where I was going to college, and I would have gotten to know them better. And I don't think Exodus would have started, at least not in the form that it became. I wish that at that time, I wish that I had had gay role models that I could talk to. I wish that when I was a little boy going to the library, there had been one book that presented being gay in a positive way, but there wasn't. So if I could go back, I'd want to find those people. I'd want to find the people that were behind the gay rights movement. I'd want to get to know them. I would want to have gotten to know, say, for example, Troy Perry of Metropolitan Community Church, and say other gay Christians, and be able to talk to people who had accepted both, that they were gay and that they were Christian. In 2007, Exodus was having its annual conference in Irvine, and Beyond Ex Gay decided to put together a counter-conference there in Irvine of ex-gay survivors, and several hundred people came for the first gathering of conversion therapy and ex-gay therapy survivors, and it was just a wonderful experience. And they talked about the parts of it that were positive for them and the parts that were negative, because there were some positive things. For a lot of people, it was their first step toward coming out. They couldn't come out yet, so they went to a group to try to change themselves, but that's where they met other people who were gay, kind of like I met Gary.
Me too.
You know, so a lot of people met their future husbands or wives at ex-gay programs. Some years ago, before Exodus closed, I started corresponding with the then president of Exodus, Alan Chambers, just to bug him. I would call him several times a week and say, "Are you still trying to sell this, Alan? Come on, you know it doesn't work." But he and I almost developed a kind of strange adversarial friendship, and I would bug him and he'd listen. Well, eventually, he decided that he needed to apologize, which shocked me. I got a call from Lisa Ling.
Who's Lisa Ling?
Lisa Ling of Our America, and I forget her new show, but Lisa Ling does documentary work on different aspects of American culture. And she said, "Guess what, Mike? Alan Chambers wants to apologize." And I said, "You're kidding me. Is this April Fool's? He really wants to apologize?" She said, "Yes, he's serious. He realizes that Exodus has caused harm and he wants to apologize." And I said, "Wow." And she said, "But I told him," she said, "if he's going to apologize, he needs to apologize to someone. Do you know any people he could apologize to?" And I said, "Boy, do I," because by that time I had started a Facebook group for ex-gay survivors. It has about 500 members now. And she said, "Could you put together a group of survivors that we could film Alan apologizing to?" And so we did. And I don't think Alan was prepared for it. We met in a church basement in Hollywood, and for 5 hours we went around the circle, and these survivors just unloaded about the pain that they felt. And I was overwhelmed by it. And the film crew started crying, and all the people in the circle started crying. And that went on for 5 hours, the most intense group therapy I'd ever been through. The only person that didn't cry was Alan Chambers.
Why do you think that?
I think he didn't cry because I frankly think he was shocked by the intensity of what he was hearing. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights. But he had already told me privately that he was considering closing Exodus. The thing he said to me is, "Mike, I don't think I can say and do what I really want to say and do as long as I am tied to Exodus and its gay to straight machine." And I thought, wow. You know, he had accepted an invitation to talk to a conference of the Gay Christian Network, and which was kind of surprising. He, unannounced, was invited to speak there, and it upset a lot of people. But he said something at that conference that just reverberated worldwide. He said, in all his years with Exodus, he could say that 99.9% of the people that came to Exodus never changed their sexual orientation. Wow. This was the president of the world's largest ex-gay organization saying that 99.9% never changed their orientation. He wasn't ready yet to say that it was harmful for everyone or that it should come to an end. But I think when he sat in that room with the survivors and heard them tell their stories, he couldn't keep doing it. I think it got to him. I think the intervention worked. When you first leave a ministry, when you're one of the former leaders of a ministry, you try to convince yourself that you didn't hurt anyone, or that you didn't hurt anyone that badly, or that you meant well. And I think, for the most part, the former leaders of these programs did mean well. They had bought the same kind of nonsense that the people coming to them had. They grew up in the same culture that said there was something wrong with them or broken about them. So they were, in a way, victims too. But they bear responsibility because they were preaching it. They were the leaders of these organizations. But you try to push that awareness away and say, I didn't harm anybody. I meant well. There comes a point, and it's different for every former leader that I've talked to, where the weight of what you've done just caves. It just caves in on you. And you think, oh my God, what have I done? What did I do here? I meant well, but I hurt people. And sometimes that's just, it's overwhelming, and it should be. When former leaders say, I feel terribly guilty, they should. They should own responsibility for it. And they should apologize for it, very specifically. But that's not enough. They need to do something about it. They need to start making amends where they can. Now, you can't undo all the harm, but maybe you can say something that can prevent more harm. Maybe a parent will hear one of the stories of a former leader and say, maybe I shouldn't send my gay child off to one of these programs. Or maybe somebody who's considering joining one of these ministries would hear a story of a survivor or a former leader and say, wait a second, maybe this is not the way to go. So I think sorry is good. Doing something about it is the most important thing. I don't know if you ever really recover from the guilt of it. I think you integrate that into who you are now. I'm a proud out gay man. I'm married and happy and love being a gay guy. My Christianity has taken a hit. Most of what I believed back in those days, I don't believe anymore. About all that I'm left with is the golden rule. Do unto others, you should have them do unto you. Most of the rest of it, I've had to let go of. When people would lash out, and boy did they, I've received some hate mail from gay people saying, you hurt me. People I had never met face to face, but they heard the message. They heard the anti-gay message. And at first I thought, well, I don't owe this person an apology. I didn't meet with them personally. And then I realized, no, they're right. I do owe them an apology. And more than that. Back in 2007, 3 former leaders came out and offered a public apology at the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center.
Do you remember their names?
Darlene Bogle from the Bay Area, Jeremy Marks from England, and me. We did a formal apology, and part of the apology was a challenge we challenged other former leaders to get honest and admit it wasn't working for them either, and to join in signing a proclamation calling for an end of ex-gay programs. There are now 24 of us. We've gradually had more and more former leaders come out and denounce the practice. We're all united in calling for a ban on conversion therapy, especially for minors, but we all really think it should be banned for everybody. It's consumer fraud, and it's harmful, it's unscientific. So all of us are united in calling for that ban. We've even had to set up a private Facebook support group for former leaders because we've got so many of us now, which is encouraging.
Yeah.
But we as former leaders, we kind of need to share our experience with each other, because unless you've been a leader of one of these programs, you don't quite understand what may have motivated a person to get involved. If you're thinking that there is something wrong with you, something broken, something inferior, something sinful, don't believe it. You are perfect as you are. You are wonderfully made, as the Bible says, and you don't need to be fixed. What needs to be fixed is the prejudice against you. If you're a parent that has a gay, lesbian, transgendered child, society and pseudoscience will try to convince you that you must have been a bad parent. Don't believe it. You are a wonderful parent, you love your child, you just don't want them to suffer the prejudice and bullying that sometimes gay kids are subjected to. But don't blame yourself because you didn't make your child gay, and even if you did make your child gay, it's a wonderful thing. So give yourself credit instead of blame. If you're a parent who's considering sending your child to a reparative therapist or an ex-gay program, I'd encourage you to do some research. Don't fall for the sales pitches. Find out about them. Look at the science behind them. Look at what every major psychological, social work, and medical organization pretty much in the world agrees, that these programs are both ineffective and harmful, especially to children. Instead, if your child needs counseling or therapy, find someone that will help them to affirm themselves and to realize that they are valuable just as they are. Do not fall for the false advertising of ex-gay programs. Focus on getting the kind of support and help you need to be the kind of person you deserve to be, and stay away from ex-gay programs. They don't work and they hurt. Back in June of 2002, a group of friends and I were attending a birthday party at a gay bar here in town. We have actually 2 gay bars here in town, and we were attending a birthday party for a mutual friend, and it was about midnight on a Wednesday, and we decided we better get home early because the next day was a work day. And as we were exiting into the back parking lot, my friend Jeffrey Owens said, "Oh, before you guys leave, I got those photographs back of our hiking trip that we took to Joshua Tree National Monument." So I thought, cool, I want to see the photographs. So we were standing around the van looking at these photographs and just having a good time, laughing and remembering what we had done. And all of a sudden, I looked up and there was this group of 5 guys rushing at us and very angry, and one of them just hauled off and punched me in the jaw without provocation, without warning of any kind. And I thought, what the hell is happening here? And temporarily I couldn't hear because of the force of the blow. But other people said that they were yelling faggot and other kinds of names as faggot as they were attacking. My friend Jeffrey, my best friend Jeffrey, heard it, and the witnesses at the trial later heard it, but I didn't. Eventually my hearing came back and I heard Jeff confronting them. They were trying to get into their pickup truck and run away. It was just a group of drunken, homophobic guys that were looking for trouble. And he said, "Hey, why are you beating up my friend? Come back, you cowards, come back and face us." And they did. They came back and they knocked Jeffrey to the ground. And Jeffrey was a military veteran, so he wasn't one that was just going to walk away from an unprovoked attack like this. I begged him, "Jeff, get in the car, get in the car. Let's leave these guys alone. It doesn't matter, I'm not that badly hurt." But he confronted them. They knocked him to the ground, kicked him and hit him, and then hopped into their pickup and sped away. And we brushed ourselves off and thought, what happened? Where did that come from? And we decided we were going to drive back to Jeffrey's house with his partner and have some coffee and kind of debrief what had just happened to us. Well, on the road there to their house, a few miles away from here, I got a call on my cell phone, and Jeffrey's partner said, "Mike, don't meet us at the house. Meet us at the hospital." And I said, "Why? What's up? What's the problem?" And they said, "Jeffrey's been stabbed and is bleeding a lot." And I thought, what? And my friend who was with me said, "Mike, lift up your shirt." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Just lift up your shirt." And I lifted up my shirt and he said, "You've been stabbed too." But I guess in the adrenaline of the moment, I knew I'd been hit, but I didn't know what had happened. So we got to the emergency room and I was diagnosed with a punctured right lung. I'd been stabbed in the back. Jeffrey had been stabbed 5 times in the back and bled to death on the operating table. And they eventually caught the guys, and I testified in court as they smirked and took it as a big joke. But I always had thought that it couldn't happen. You know, you'd hear stories about hate crimes and you'd think, oh, how sad. But I didn't think it could happen here in peaceful Riverside, and I didn't think it could happen to me. But that, in addition to everything I'd been through with ex-gay programs, convinced me that I hadn't continued to speak out, because anti-gay hatred is still very much alive. And I'm afraid that it's being fanned. That hatred and that fear is being fanned by the political climate that we're in and the social climate that we're in. So I do think the two things are linked, the ex-gay message that there's something wrong or broken about you that needs to be fixed, and anti-gay violence. Because if you keep preaching to people that there's something wrong with being gay and you need to be fixed, that's going to embolden somebody who thinks, okay, we'll fix them permanently. In Jeff's case, I think that anti-gay hatred resulted in violence, and it resulted in his death, and people are still being targeted for being gay. So it's part of the reason I want to see ex-gay therapy programs come to an end, to end that message that gays need to be fixed, if not temporarily, maybe permanently. I think a federal ban on reparative therapy would help. The trouble is that most of these programs are kind of immune from bans because they're protected under the First Amendment under freedom of religion. Most of these ex-gay programs are offered by churches and are religiously based. So you can do bans against licensed therapists doing it and forbid, for-profit therapy. But how do you convince fundamentalist Christians to stop doing it? By enacting bans, that says something important to the culture at large, that this is something that's so harmful and so unscientific that they're banning it legally for adults. So think twice about getting involved in it. So even though you may not be able to ever outlaw religious programs, you can send a strong message to the culture. My name is Michael Bussee, and I'm an ex-gay leader. My name is Michael Bussee. I'm one of the co-founders of Exodus International. I'm Michael Bussee. I'm one of the founders of Former Ex-Gay Leaders Alliance, which is a coalition of 24 former leaders of conversion therapy or ex-gay therapy programs. If you're a former leader of an ex-gay or conversion therapy program, we invite you to join the Former Ex-Gay Leaders Alliance and help us to put an end to ex-gay programs and conversion therapy.